Okay, so we're here for the return of movement and philosophy. We've been speaking a little bit, and we have also Jon with us, who will be doing some art alongside. Whenever the moment calls, I suppose the muse has got to be present in some form. But we were speaking about somewhere in the area of what a politics of movement might mean. That's one of the things that's circling. I was sharing in response to Corey's observation that breaking as an art form, you can do it for 10 to 15 years and you may still only be okay. It's got this absolutely massive skill curve, whereas something like physical activity in terms of gym or running, you can maybe achieve a higher degree of competence in some ways more quickly. And I was thinking about the difference between art forms that require extreme explosion and physical capacity that moves right to the edge. So it gets to the edge of chaos, but wants to stay in a place of smoothness and flow and artistic presentation so that when the spectator looks upon it, you can see the many negativities when control is lost. Whereas in the case of something like jujitsu or another fighting style, the preference is for effectiveness and instrumentality and zero sum violence on the edge of that chaos. And I think there's something interesting about where, what is dictating or what is influencing how we show up on the boundary of things in general as to whether we're able to stay flowing, stay smooth, or whether there's some pressure and what that might be to collapse into a way that works to the detriment of someone else or to distinguish between yourself and someone else in perhaps a violent way. I mean, I'm getting toward those elements of a politics of movement, whatever that might be. Benjamin Studebaker speaks about politics as the domain of intractable difference. And if you can't figure things out elsewhere, you go to the political. Otherwise, they would have been figured out elsewhere, and you maybe have some contest, and there's an element of zero sum to it. Now, there's lots to say about that, but that's some of what's present in the space. I have a question for you guys, as I know that, fighting's also part of the general interest in movement. Are there times, I can imagine there are, where, Jen, there might be a choice between, am I gonna choke this guy out or am I gonna be choked out? And you can kind of sense that there might be a better technique or a more graceful way to move position, but actually you kind of realize that it's easier cognitively for you to just use your physical capability in that moment to get the position rather than yourself be choked out. And I'm curious about that dynamic as you experience it. Do you try and you see, because like what's doing the right thing in that like the right thing is always like to not be choked out. And yet there is a technique that if you master it will make you better in more situations, have more leverage, more degrees of freedom, all the rest of it.
There's a few things percolating. I'll see if I can put them together. In the context of a partner practice like jujitsu, you're actually only simulating the real conditions of a fight where you're in full contact with one another and needing to forcefully maneuver the other person towards your own advantage. And yet, in the heat of the moment, there's this competitive edge that both sides have, which makes them both rush to the more effective or instrumental result over and above having patience to engage in the artful process of understanding you're actually in this together because you're in the gym. It's all artificial, but you've actually allowed yourself to be duped into thinking that's the real situation where you're needing to prove a point. So there's something in there around patience as the condition for artful politics of the body to emerge. And then also the inherent rush that we feel ourselves drawn along by. This might be somewhat connected to what me and Corey were talking about earlier also regarding the recent rename of the Voicecraft channel to Altered States of Conversation, where Corey pointed out that we are already by default always in a state of alteration. And so there's a need not to identify too wholly with any particular container through which we seek to alter ourselves, be it exogenous, as is in the wordplay of altered states of consciousness, typically referring to psychedelics, or endogenous through movement practices, meditative practices, whatever field you want to find yourself growing in. So there's that. And then there's also, just to point back to the skill curve in breaking specifically, I had in mind also that there's a question of access to education, which is entirely political. You need to actually go to the OGs, so to speak. You need to go to the original people who were, the wellspring of this creative impulse in a very unique context, which was under a lot of pressure. A lot. And so as we get further and further away from that origin, be it in space or time, it's been just over 50 years, 55 years since the official inception of hip hop. Obviously, it was bubbling away in Black and Latino culture for the longest time. And, I think in some sense, depending on the historical breadth we want to take, we could speak to the beat as something intrinsic to all humans by way of the heart. So, yeah, a few things.
I didn't realize my microphone was on. I wanted to share on that point that you were sort of leading to, Tim, with maybe this technique versus explosiveness, and how that sort of shows up. And Jurnee's absolutely right. We are sort of recreating these scenarios where there's these supposed sort of outcomes or consequences. But yeah, I just wanted to speak a little bit about how that explosiveness is somewhat utilized or weaponized against our opponents. And that's part and parcel with this physical practice of learning. And if we take jiu-jitsu, for example, maybe you could conceptually also think of it as like Tai Chi push arms. You're looking to create a scenario, a dialogue with the partner that you feel confident you'll be able to use technique and effectively stifle their technique. Explosiveness and strength and capacity all comes into it. So the secondary layer or process that's also going is if this person uses strength in order to suppress the technique that I'm using, I'm also going to anticipate that and redirect that strength in the step of like what might be like comically thought of the Jackie Chan kung fu movies, where they throw the big punch and you sidestep and they use all this energy. And that is also part of the process of the long engagement of the task, which then starts to whittle them down, starts to allow them to have more mistakes, And I think it's interesting because it's what we're trying to, whether conscious or unconscious, we're trying to reproduce this situation of decisiveness, this wu wei, decisionless decision in so many aspects. And this has happened even with chess. They play chess with timers now because they're trying to force this behavior of like, we don't want you to sit on this argument for so long that you figure out, oh, okay, I need to move my thing here. We want to create some kind of scenario where there's this contention of like, shit, do I need to move here? Should I move here? Am I gonna regret this decision? Maybe I just need to make it, and then from this position make another. And yeah, in the same way that if we're still thinking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example, they have this format where it's generally for like the first 5 to 10 minutes, it's just try to submit your opponent. And if there's a stalemate, then we bring in point scoring. So there's these sort of like conditions to force certain responses and behaviors. And like I said, it appears in everything like chess or in any kind of other sort of competitive realm, collaborative competitive. But I think it's interesting to examine. They're all trying to elicit this flow that you're talking about, which is being composed in the decision-making process with a historical competency, but then also a confidence in oneself to adapt in whatever ways necessary, because we're at this appropriate and adequate level testing with a partner, with our opponent. So that was some of the things that I was sort of pulling together for when you guys are talking.
Yeah, and sometimes you find out, don't you? Sometimes you find out that your historical competence is not as competent as and you might have the confidence to adapt, but can you actually, And so that level testing aspect, and there's something, I guess, in that case, there is a violence or a zero sumness to the competitive aspect, which is the say in taking breaking, where you find out whether you can stay smooth at that boundary. And so there's something about the violence or the the potentially really abrasive integrity check is being, it's a property of the art form or of the competitive dynamic itself. And I guess as we've discussed before, as you move closer to the more purely violent, right, through the martial arts and then ultimately into fighting to the death and war and what have you, that, the, well, you could say like the checksum of it is who gets choked out or who dies and who doesn't, rather than some shared sense of whether or not someone was more artful on the line. Except, so the reason why this is interesting to me is that you can actually say, well, is it the case that political order in our time, of most times, maybe all times, has always been on the basis of might makes right? Now, I'm not arguing that necessarily, but there's a strong argument to be made for that, and you kind of have to, really lean into, I think, idealism and I think various spiritual perspectives unfolding slowly throughout time to touch in with and integrate with something other than that, something other than might makes right. So, for instance, can justice, as you brought up before we started recording, to what degree can justice as something universal, as a virtue, as a value that is beyond all of us individually, and yet in our embodiment, in our activity, is made real in some way? Can that be sufficiently strong as an aspiration to bind people together in some process which doesn't just uh, check itself on the violence, doesn't ultimately just fall into an order based on zero sum violence? And so I do see, art forms, sports, and all of that as tremendously aspirational in showing the way for the possibility of our applying this sense we have to improve, compete, distinguish, aspire, right? And have it not be that which is just falling into violence. But, there's interesting questions there, right? And because people can look, well, is the sport corrupt? Were the judges actually just? Are the rules fair? All these types of things obviously come into sport and what have you. And breaking, obviously, being way more on the subjective side of what's good. Well, I mean, how much should that be paying its dues to the historical people from whence it came? And how much is there potentially something more universal in aspiration around what the human body can do in a space? And how much ought it depart from that, paying its respects, but ultimately not be held to that past standard? And that then also can become a question for the politics of movement.
That was good. So, schismogenesis, that idea about how things deviate from their origins and create new forms, different kinds of species emerging out of shared ancestors. And then the question of, in and amongst all that, various lineages of skills and techniques which were conditioned by the context of the original participants. I guess in some sense, I'm hearing myself say maybe might does make right, in the sense that a new generation will usurp the previous, as is so often the case. And yet also, does something come to mind?
There is a certain responsibility for a new generation to do the due diligence of seeking out the foundational origins of a form. And in order to adapt into something new that's accumulating, that pays respect to that traditional form, to call it hip hop or to call it breaking, that due diligence would be necessary. Otherwise, it's starting from scratch. And yeah, I think that it's that process which has allowed dance to expand the way that it has within the street dance scene. I guess in more of a classical realm. It's fascinating because it all comes back to expression of culture. So we bring it back to the people and to their values and what it is that they're wanting to express as well. Yeah.
Well, there's something about the way the institutions hold the line, but then the streets that sprawl throughout the city, that is where so much novel interpretation and relation with the form just doesn't start from scratch per se, but it's not starting from a legible place of this is what they've done and I'm doing just that.
Jen, can I jump in just because I want to see if I can integrate what's coming up in Jon's painting? Because as you are speaking now, right, we've got this, I'm getting a lot of like, forest, floor, jungle, and there's, so the dark greens are there. And then just as you're speaking that, there's these pops of red or pink coming through, and are they flowers potentially, this type of thing. And so there is like that sense of you have this base, but then all of a sudden the flower, and then the flower is actually very distinct. But the flowers obviously like can't be there without the roots. And maybe people think of the flowers and all the attention can go towards the flowers, and the kind of maybe like the sludge of the soil that ends up the browns, the greens becoming the browns kind of stay there. And it's interesting, isn't it? Like how far do you go back into the roots of a lineage? How much is it the part of the evolutionary story of human beings, and whatever other kind of aspirational way you'd kind of like to maybe frame what the form of the human being is, as something geometric or what have you, that there's, in a sense, we're all part of this long lineage of whether adaptivity, but also symmetry, beauty, and all these types of things. And so, in a sense, like any dance lineage does have its roots in an even deeper soil to the point. But then, it's so interesting. I know that it's a silly thought really, but when I'm watching reels of people dance, one of the types that comes up is like the amount that people have pursued like the robotic now, and like the insect robot is one of the things that certain types of people do. They're often really skinny people, right? And they can just do all manner of things. And so there is this kind of like, and that's maybe like an exploration of these other kinds of forms. It's like, what was it like when we didn't have vertebrae? You know what I mean? And it's like, what is that homage? And some people are like, yeah, that's cool, but like, I don't know if I like truly want to be like that myself, but we kind of get it, you know? Um, yeah, there's a long story to tell, isn't there? There's this, and it's an aspirational story. Like, what can present the form? I guess it's not just well though, isn't it? Because we also like to be surprised, but then partly we are shocked at our own form and our own nature and part of art. And I get that a lot with movement, coming along to see your performance and the other performances there, like horror and the awfulness of the awful awesome counterpart is like very much present there. It's kind of like a visceral reminder of just um, the ways that bodies and people can be if we weren't so constrained into a particular sense of what the right politics of movement among each other should be, that we should approach walking with nice posture, extend the hand for a handshake or a hug, and definitely not do like an insect fucking crawl around them before all manner of things, right?
I was just going to ask, John, when we were talking about some of the decisionless decision and we will weigh, are you applying that in some of your art and process?
Yeah, I've I guess studied it a lot over the years, and it kind of worked its way into it. Yeah, a lot of it's just kind of let it kind of follow where it goes, and kind of see what impressions come out of the responses, that kind of thing. Spend a lot of time outside too, so.
Yeah, I am around sort of artists and was involved in art and murals, and one thing I am trying to come back to, but also I realize my resistance to it. Art in the form of just creating for the joy of it is both the simplest and the hardest thing to do in my experience, to put the line down without critiquing it and just know that it is a process of many hundreds of thousands of lines that need to be allowed to be brought forth from the activity of art and creating it, not so much trying to create it. And there's a lot of discussion now on people that care about art, that like where there is a culture of trying to create the art for the audience eyes first as the primary vehicle driving it, rather than trying to just be involved in the art, in an art making process.
Yeah, I think a lot of 'cause I've really not shared a lot of it. A lot of it is just a practice more than anything. Time to kind of something quiet to do at night and let things kind of, it kind of changes the shape of your understanding in a lot of ways. And you can see it in it, and then you can, of course, you can see it in other things when you step out into it. I've actually kind of neglected this, so I'm glad you asked me to do it. I've been building a lot of stuff lately. We got chickens recently, and I've been working on I've been building a brooder, and I've got a chicken coop. I've got a bunch of wood laying out and ready for me to start putting that together. So I've been really physical lately. Yeah, I can only imagine with as much movement as you guys are talking about doing. I uh, I imagine when that's got to feel really good. And
I had a couple points that I wanted to quickly get out before we sort of move forward, but it was in response to some stuff that Beck was saying, and then I'll tie it back in together. But we've been able to identify movement as art, but I also think it's interchangeable that art is movement. And even what you were saying, John, that I've been building things with my hands, and it sounds so good to do so much movement that we do. But on the opposite side of the fence, I'm looking at what you're doing, and I'm seeing it as another form of movement, as another form of building things with your hands. What I wanted to say in terms of what you were discussing, Beck, is this younger generation, and that we need to lead and provide framework. And what we're seeing with the younger generation is that it becomes extractive without an exchange or a transaction. So because young people, children in the process, are able to adapt with such neuroplasticity, they're achieving, the gold medalist skateboarder is like 9 years old. We have like breaking athletes who are 7 years old doing the most complex sort of dynamic acrobatic gymnastic movements. But without the origins and the teachings that go with all of that, without nursing and creating consideration and care to what people went through in the process of building the art form, we just become extractive to the point there won't be anything more to pull from, and we'll end up at this standstill, I predict. And you won't have people expressing creatively. You'll have people expressing within the conduct of what is going to win, what is going to succeed. And where a lot of this art form was born from was not from a desire to win. It was a desire to express, and in many ways, the agency to define oneself. So, Tim, when you talk about how people have moved into this robotic form, the androiding, the robot form, were rejections of ballet, where ballet's superimposed forms were seen as the institutional academia. They were seen as the enlightenment. And people didn't have access to that, and it was kept segregated. But people still have the capacity to create and define their own art forms. And so the militant resistant, and a lot of art form is built through resistance, whether it's Eastern martial arts or dance and culture and so forth, is, like this rejection of people, of the status quo, our conceptually limited mind, and like I said, the agency to define oneself. So those were some points that I was sort of tethering together from different places.
Yeah, it's always interesting the what about us, or remember me, or we're here, or fuck you, you know? that is in that counter response, and what it's drawing on. It's like we can do it like this, but is it? But that's I do wonder. Like, so I often joke that when I've been along to Dufs and some of the larger festivals, that especially in the, especially when it really gets going, that the people who frequent festivals on this land, Australians, are swamp people. There's a lot of like real like toad frog vibes that go on either on the dance floor or just in people's the affect of people's dress and how they move and look. Now, not always, obviously, but I definitely noticed that in a really palpable way, and I've been drawn into that flow, you know. And I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is, but I do wonder how much a memory, whether it's of a land or of our form throughout different periods, like I was saying, or that we've, before becoming human, we also bear the history of other forms. And so what is it to express those which still live in our body as a living history? And so I wonder when it's a kind of like, fuck you, there's a sense in which it is, on the one hand, an aspiration to something different, but often like a lot of the strength is drawn from what's actually being ignored or shadowed by what Corey would be pointing to in terms of the institutional or the enlightenment. That it's pursued down this way and it makes this way a kind of elitist way, but actually like in its shadow is this whole bunch of energetic potential. So there's something, yeah, interesting about that. Like how much I don't know, can it be the case that you can just do wild shit that's totally, how can you even make sense of something that's like absolutely disconnected from something? Like we're bound by our form, right? Like how we move as bodies is ultimately bound by what we are at some level. We can try and move like another creature or move like this other thing, but we're still doing it with our limbs. We're still doing it, and people have our contortionists and whatever, but the knees bend one way. Maybe some people have got like double whatever, right? But the knees bend one way. So yeah, there is this there's this energy of we're all in this together, but what's being ignored that I think is really powerful.
That space of energy that you spoke to, Tim, feels like that condition which it reminds me of that condition that you create to build skill. Like almost finding those edge points where you are pushed to a point that an expression is required to continue on. You mentioned, what about us? Like the, I guess, defiance of self and necessity to act. I wrote act similar to an act of violence, but I don't think violence is the right word. It
Are you looking for something more neutral?
Yeah, maybe a little more neutral.
I was thinking
But
about force.
Yeah.
There's a violent force, which is something that you don't. It's a force from outside that you would resist, but maybe just don't have the strength to.
Yes.
But there are benevolent forces that come from beyond as well, in the more guiding sense of beauty, pulling us along towards that which we do not yet know, and yet we're always receptive towards.
An adaptation to define oneself, or that's like.
I just want to jump in here.
Yeah.
I'll put this in and continue a thought. I don't think violence is a bad framework. You can apply the thought the application. Childbirth is violent. childbirth is like would be described as like one of the most violent processes, but it's a good thing. It's like the baby doesn't want to do it. The body is going through this process. So I think you can still apply it, just if we manage what we either are limiting around violence, because nature is violent inherently, and it's nature. So, but yeah, I just wanted to pop that in. I don't think you're describing it in the wrong way. I think it's a cool thread to pull.
Yeah, I think there's something about the process to adapt, or, you're pushing out a baby. So your body is adapting to this new stage of life, which it is quite violent. A butterfly emerging from a cocoon is horrific. But yeah, I think it's that transitional process which is creating the conditions, and that is an energetic force, and that's where growth and strife to create flourish.
To be clear, I wasn't against the notion of violence as intrinsic to all generative processes. Well, yeah, not so much against as wanting to involve in a broader scheme. But then the point about the butterfly emerging from the cocoon or the child from the womb, I've been watching a lot of alien clips, and those are viscerally horrific. Just seeing the face huggers jump onto someone's face, force their way down into the body, and be like, yo, motherfucker, I'm going to break your fucking ribs open and scream, and then I'm going to eat you. It's wild the way that we can actually depict nature's more gruesome elements. And yet, I just want to say "and yet" because I want there to be an "and yet," and I think there is. Part of it came through Tim. I'll let you carry through, but I just wanted to refer back to Jon's point before. I thought there was something really interesting in being in the process of art making, where the approach is less about swapping pre-existing frames out and then reframing and shifting, so much as actually giving birth to new frames. And you're just kind of surrendered to that, which is why I was thinking of it as a more receptive process rather than expressive. But then when I say that, they're kind of collapsing down, and they're on this point between the emergence of the new from the old. So, whatever that boundary point between them is, which Beck pointed to, it is an interesting place to be, and that is, in the literature on flow, where flow best occurs. So we can't actually always be there, though. Like, just like, if we're actually just being real politically, we are bound by our previous forms, not just within the body, but within the political body, within the polis. So there's a time and place for the reception of frames that could be, and the expression of resistance against frames which are, and then also affirmation of frames which are, because they actually do seem to be more of a benevolent invitation for what's worthwhile to come through.
Yeah, so trying to stay with the thread of violence and changing frames and what's more worthwhile to come through, giving birth, all that sort of thing. I've started refereeing football matches. I've only done 3, but what I've said before is like, all right, no violence, but compete, and no bullshit. No bullshit, no violence, but compete as hard as you want, right? And so what do I mean by violence in that context? You kind of know it when you see it, but to put a distinction on it, it's something like use the kind of force, make the kind of impact that purposefully destroys the possibility to share in the frame of playing football together. So if I like try to break your leg rather than try to make a tackle, then, you know, obviously that will affect your ability to play football, but it destroys the possibility of our actually competing in the same thing together in that way. And so there's like a severe crossing of the line. And this links to the thought of thinking about the real, which is sometimes used in psychoanalytic context, particularly with Jacques Lacan, where Cadell will express it as something like all of a sudden you thought you were off to work, but then you got hit by a bus, right? And so there was this other frame, this other function, these other factors in reality that interrupted what you thought was going on and broke you out of the fantasy of what you were doing. And so this sense of there being things which we're not attending to, are not aware of, which can all of a sudden abruptly, violently come in. I don't think real is only violent, but certainly the abruption of it. And we get it in art, you know, in movement, sometimes in film, where all of a sudden that was like a really violent transition, you know, an abrasive, violent transition. All of a sudden we were here and then we were there. And so we're kind of playing with just the reality of how life can switch up on us. I guess like one of the challenges when it comes to uh, human beings is just that, as is often said, because of our reflective capacity and our compounding intelligence capacity through working together, and we can build weapons of mass destruction, destroy ecologies, and the jumps we've been able to make in sort of deframing or reframing, territorializing, to use the Deleuzian term, the whole world, whole ecologies just totally destroyed, you know. And so there's this sense of coming into awareness around when violence tends toward the kind of destructiveness that can just end the game completely is super important. And that in nature, although we are expressions of it, there seem to be these much more tightly connected balance of power relationships, so that, you know, evolution progresses at a certain pace and no one apex predator becomes so powerful that they just destroy the whole category of the ecology itself. So people say like the gazelle gets a bit faster and the lion gets a bit faster, but they go kind of slowly together. So people, you know, forests will often make those types of points. So there's something in there that for me is like important to help clarify violence. And then I'll just share, just so we still have time, I wanted to share the thought I actually had that I didn't get to last conversation, but was what I had in seeing Jurnee's performance and then the other performances on the evening a few months ago. And the thought I wrote down was just recognizing how much the journey of the movement itself was necessary in order to have the body and the energy be in the right place, so as for that sort of peak moment, the next drop, the image of it, to actually have the meaning it had. Because you've seen just what strenuations and efforts went into the whole journey, so that naturally the climax of something, you get to see it in a particular way, or you feel it in a particular way. And I guess in movies and stories are like this. You don't just jump right to the end, you build it all up. So there's something just at the brute energetic level around sort of working oneself up into the position to be able to give a particular movement that I found interesting. And then distinguishing that from other kinds of art and then philosophy. Whereas, you know, interestingly here we've been able to see Jon sort of create and see its different phases. But often when you look at a painting, you see it all in one, and you don't see the history of that movement. Whereas in course in dance performances, you see the journey is as much a part of the art, and you get to see it across time. And I think sometimes people think of philosophy in these ways. Sometimes people want like, what's the point of it? Just get to your point. What's actually the contention. What does it actually mean? And there's something to be said for that, right? Coming to a place of clarified proposition and a conclusion. But then there's also going on the journey to be able to actually arrive at making those conclusive steps yourself, or being able to see them, and just thinking of all of the practice you put into whatever art form before you're able to bring it into clarity or cohesiveness, and all the different failings and confusions. And there's something about that philosophy as a seen as an art form in this regard, I think opens it up to, yeah, a more fuller understanding of what it is to do philosophy.
So there's something to do with humanity's supernatural ability to extract results over and above process, so that the results are purely instrumental and they lose touch with the hand that actually plays them. Now they're just playing themselves in some auto-masturbatory way.
Yeah, like not really appreciating it. It's kind of like a having thing. So losing, like losing the being of actually the being of the process of understanding or appreciating or valuing, and then the extracted, fixed, accumulated thing at the end of it. We say we're successful because we possess the thing and have the thing. And so, what is the most effective way to get that? Yeah, is what I hear you saying there. And yeah, I definitely think there's something to that. And of course, artificial intelligence is another example of this, at least applied in certain ways. You don't even have to write the book now to be an author. You know what I mean? It can just do it all for you, except it's doing something very different, obviously. But yeah, that drive towards effectiveness of whatever the outcome that's wanting to be achieved is. And I think the question is like, well, what game are we actually playing together? And again, why I find football and other collaborative artistic activities so necessary and so important, because you are cultivating a shared sense of what's worth creating together. You get a sense of how you contribute to the field, which makes it worthwhile, because it is just a bunch of people kicking a ball around into a net. You can make it endlessly absurd. And yet when, people hold themselves to the aspiration of what that can be as an art form, then, you can enjoy being part of the the fantasy of it. And same thing, of course, with dance. It's like if you watch a music video without music, most of the time it's just outrageous. Like, what is going on here? You kind of decontextualize it. But when you sort of affirm the fuller contextualization of what's actually intended in the art form, then it's like, okay, yeah, we get what's kind of being aspired to here. You're moving your body to the beat. Nice one.
So is the question here about how we can stoke in one another a willingness to participate in that kind of process, be it through the movements that we offer. Hey, move like this, move like that. That was very broad. That was very general. It was a bit, but it's more like,
Yeah, I think we have to the impossible, like the thing that's so difficult when we really stretch the territory philosophically is that there's all of this. There's such complexity that our lives, whether sit on top of or are influenced by or in relation with, there's all this history of nature and functionality of that, right? From sexuality throughout, yeah, a whole range of just what it is to be a body in relation with the sun, and all this like visceral stuff. And then there's all the constructions of culture, which are in so many ways extremely delicate and fine tuned, and often also in their own ways way too short term in their outlook with respect to how they interact with dynamics in nature. So it's like, okay, well, those need to change, except we also rely on them. So we can't just like live a totally different way straight away. People still, you know, find themselves needing to earn money and regulate their energy and all the rest of it. And so the point is that there are all these various frames or ways in which patterns of our being in the world don't seem to, well, harmonize or line up that well together, and create all this kind of death and illness and disease and frustration and recognition that the Titanic's approaching the iceberg here and there, but no one's kind of got enough leverage just in and of themselves to turn the tiller, and it turns out the whole boat's actually this writhing mass of individual relations, and it's not just something you could turn anyway. And so what do you do about that? But yeah, it's no, and so the challenging thing is just noticing the the continual process of learning how we are involved here and there in shaping and influencing situations, but then also how we, in our collaboration with others, then end up influencing situations, and so our network participation with each other, and so at our levels of collectivity, and so coordinating with respect to that in all these different ways, when there's just such a beast of a leviathan that's got all these moving parts. I think that's so challenging, and I guess we get to a sense of it through art, don't we? We have to almost like create little pockets where elements of it can spring up or can be illuminated, and that can sort of remind us in flashing moments of illumination how the rest of it can reveal itself, or how we can orient. Because how you just be overwhelmed if every movement in your life, and maybe actually this would be a good thing to explore from a Wu Wei perspective, right? Because if you were attempting to kind of be like some profound energetic conduit for the climax of an artistic process in your every movement in life, wouldn't that just be exhausting? In the way that Taryn, when she paints, it's like, and when I write, it's like I can give that a certain amount of hours of consciousness a day, then I need to recover and what have you. And sometimes I feel like I'm in flow and I can add a lot of value, but then I need to withdraw a bit. Um, and is that, too much pushing upstream? Can we get to a point where just, as Nietzsche said, the life as a work of art, but then Nietzsche like was not a healthy guy, okay? Like this was not someone who like embodied the philosophy of health alongside the sense of life being as a work of art. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that it's a sacrifice in that regard, and that we shouldn't use our health for risk and energetic expenditure and all of that. But the point is that there's an awful lot of the world, and we are obviously small aspects of it. And so there's something to be said for just like, I guess, like the humility of making art in the ways we can with each other in a more humble way, being humbled, so to speak, in our in our relation with art, right?
I had some thoughts, just continuing to build on what seemed to be some of the themes of it around violence and politics of movement. Whether this continues on a thread, but examining just when you speak to the boys, for example, and it's like, hey, look, I want you to purposefully play the game with some intention behind it, whether you say that that's violence or not. But also, I think it might be interesting to discuss with the boys, what is creative violence versus oppressive violence? Really build up people not to be afraid of looking at this word, because if we're looking at the scope of movement and then in these other categories of dance, the body was always politically controlled and informed and violently repressed, and majorities of forms of dance and expression and movement have all been curated through an elitist lens and have been resisted. So if we look at sort of Black culture through the 1950s and 60s of dance, that was very much limited and put on as spectacle in order for them to justify their existence. And this is a very common nature of violence, the violence of expression of existence. One of the ways I see this is because I watch time to time Olympic weightlifting. which is very, very high competitive sport. But there are opportunities for like these underdog athletes from far less financially supportive nations like Samoa or Fiji, where they have real grassroots programs. But some of these athletes win these gold medals, and it's a representation, a violent representation of expression. And it needs to be in order to complete the lift, the task that they've undertaken. So we're the politics of movement, the politics of what you were allowed to be able to express, what we're allowed to express now, what is repressive, what was suppressed. I mean, capoeira is another beautiful form and thread that you could discuss on, like, people had to find creative ways to exist and ingenuity and use movement. Movement is always political. And because movement and art are interchangeable, art is always political in the same way. When I was thinking, and we've got Jon working here, and I was inspired to think of Van Gogh and how his existence was violence. He was someone with some severe crutches and burdens in life and ostracized, and this violent existence that he went through and then left behind. We could only figure out afterwards what the merit of some of this expression was, which one had to be so militant and resistant and determined to continue to get out this form of existence, this form of representation and self-determination and definition. And a good person understands the capacity for violence, but endures where possible to defer. But in that sense also stands on redefining, because I remember what you said is, who defines violence? Again, it's like they were defining how bodies were moving, how women were dancing as violent, as antithetical to a society of cohesion and order. And, that's part of nature. Nature and chaos are the antithesis of the order that we try to superimpose on nature. And why I say that, like, childbirth is a violent act. You don't choose to be born. You're forcefully thrust into this world, kicking and screaming. There's a great analogy where, potentially from the from the perspective of the baby, they're about to die. They're dying in childbirth. It feels like that. It's like it could be the last moment of their life, and then suddenly they're on the other side, and it's actually the start of their life because of how violent and chaotic and scary it is.
So death at the beginning and death at the end. Both of those transitions are violent.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if both are. There's definitely, I think, a way to meet death, and that's another sort of space. But just examining violence within the political spectrum as imposed on movement, the context of how we define violence and what resistance to violence is, and existence as violence, resistance as violence, in order to shift the needle forward and bring us into spaces of where we have art to flourish, where violence has tried to burn down libraries and destroy art from, like, dynasties abroad. yeah, there's lots and lots to examine within the space of movement, within the space of violence, where they intersect. But if we're staying sort of around this realm of movement and art forms of movement, it's always been very political, very resistant, and I really I don't consume these things these days without knowing like where they came from, like being in China and studying kung fu there and knowing that this was in the same way as capoeira, this was, you know, the people to equip themselves for the real world circumstances of warring armies, militias, empires upon everyday peasantry and people, which we've now extrapolated to this. Well, Tai Chi in the park looks really good, and you know your doctor's like, oh, well, you know, maybe you should be trying these mindfulness practices. So there's this huge lineage as well, which again comes back to if we are extractive without an exchange of understanding, context, history, the lineage, what people went through, endured to create, yeah, we lose so much. And there are strategies that some forms of our postmodernism do deliberately to stifle this. And this is what I think around the sort of capitalist nature of some of our dance forms and art forms now. And Jurnee and I sort of experience this in breaking, where it's this Red Bull company has kind of like positioned itself at the top form as the entry point, instead of the entry point actually being culture at the bottom up. It's like dance and culture and ciphers and people listening to music and who were people creating music and why were people resorting to creating music, because they didn't have third spaces to exist in, and there was violent socio and economic structures enforced on people that created this art form.
So there was something there about, and I know that we need to wrap up, but I just on that last point, something again about access to education, which is where I come in through this. And in that sense, access to education by way of participation in the culture, the way that the extraction of the spectacle that that culture can offer the uninitiated is made out as though it's the only entry point into it. And this is a great deception that I think is, it rings true to me that there's something being hollowed out in the original coming to be of that. I just wanted to say that. And then I also wanted to say something in me wants to resist the resistance, in the sense that making politics intrinsically violent is, to me, positioning politics firmly on the other side of the boundary between chaos and order, in the realm of chaos. And I would not deny that that is occurring, but I would also stretch it into that transition point. And like there's something there for me still in catching flow there that can anticipate the potential degeneration into pure violence and redirect it or force it either violently. I don't know if, you know what I'm saying? Like, I just don't know that you can actually just violently force violent forces away from a more rooted place where the culture can situate itself so that it can flourish and be open to the creation of the frames. But I'm not gonna like press into that any further here.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just say there's definitely a few things to pick up on in closing. There was a way in which I was hearing you speak to politics as something which is a process which exists on or moves between both sides of the violent and non-violent gradient or change point. And I was kind of wondering, could there be an art form that could mirror that in the sense of, and, maybe debate and aspects of philosophy, but I was thinking it would be a wild thing to watch breaking, except when things got too heated, the people just actually started to like do jujitsu on each other, but then went back to breaking. Like, could that
That in
happen?
ice hockey, they have the brawls and then they just
That's
Yeah,
good.
they do have that a
they
little
did
bit.
have that in breaking early on.
Yeah. So that's curious, right? Like, so what mediates the movement between are we actually fighting here versus then dancing? But of course, just like with MMA and what have you, there are still rules, and it's
I'll
getting close
interject.
to fight. Please.
Breaking had to be self-governed. If it resorted only to violence, and there's a very thin line where breakers have this understanding that if we allow ourselves to get pushed into an escalation of fists, we lose everything we built. Because it's already a structure of like, oh, these people are counterculture. They are doing stuff that is undefined. And so many examples of history for people creating an art form and a movement had to tread the line of operating within a society that wants to either capitulate, reform, diminish, suppress, erase culture. This is a behavior of many empires and states. So they really understand that they want to push themselves. This is also two parts of it. They want to push themselves to the point of like, I want to do everything to win this battle. I'm going to tear the shirt off my back. But if it gets to the escalation of violence, I've lost, because the culture needs to stay and remain, and they care about that. Maybe Jurnee can add more to that as well, but I think that that's important delineation of people knowing that, like, if we allow this to go past, we lose control of everything that we've built.
Which is the same logic that empires have, even though they're operating at larger scales and seeking to suppress subcultures, which could potentially, for them, do just the same. I don't believe that's true, but I'm saying they have to anticipate the potential for that to occur. But anyhow, I feel like this is its own thread, and Tim was kind of blinking on a point of closure.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, yeah, certainly interesting. I guess there's a question around, in bringing in the broader political situation, kind of what's relevant there is that the breakers kind of have like this underlying cultural political alignment that they care about because of its politics of relation to the state or whatever, right? And I'm kind of wondering about just the possibility for an art form as such. So let's not make it about breaking necessarily, but would an art form be most, this I really ask this as an open question, would an art form that's most resembling of politics, if politics is that which, right, is the conversation before war and then the conversation that happens during war to attempt to return, if it's on both sides of that, then what kind of art form could, like, can you have an art form that because there's massive risk there. It's like all of a sudden the game might end, right? Someone, there might not be need for politics after this because violence has put an end to violence. So there's something interesting in there about, wanting to speak to that, the existence of something that's both potentially constructive. And this may be like the last one of it. I don't really think it's the last resort of constructive. I think I'm a little bit more theological or spiritual than that. So, yeah, I think maybe we can return to it and explore what's deeper than a politics of movement. Like what what is the sacredness of movement? You know what I mean? The sacredness of movement as distinct from a politics of movement or something like that as a provocative framing could be one. But the other thing I just wanted to say was, John, when I was watching you before, and of course now, but there was a point where you were dropping little drops of green on, and I was really just focusing in on it. And I had the same experience as I sometimes have when I watch Tarrant. And it was like very energizing. It was very exciting and very risky because the drops were kind of going down, and then I'm seeing them become leaves, and they were taking on a different the edges were very dark green. And there was just something very exciting about seeing the liquid, like the chaotic element. You're trying to put them in particular places, but then kind of you have to go with what happens to them. And so I just wanted to share that I was on that journey with you. I don't know if were you finding it exciting? I'm kind of curious about that. But maybe we should bring
Yeah,
this to a
yeah,
close now.
yeah.
You were?
Yeah,
You
I can
were?
tell
It
you
was
after. I can
exciting.
tell you after. Yeah, we can talk about it after.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Are we all right to wrap it up there, guys?
Yeah.
Beautiful.